History Zone, where the past comes alive.
In the heart of the Deep South, amidst the turmoil of the Civil War, lay a county that dared to defy.
They tell history like it was a clean thing. Blue against gray, north against south. But where I grew up, history didn't march in neat lines. It crept through the woods. It starved children. And it asked a question no one wanted to answer. Which side are you on? My name doesn't matter much anymore. What matters is that I was born in Jones County, Mississippi, a place so poor and isolated that the Civil War barely noticed us until it did. We were farmers, pine cutters, small families scattered between creeks and swamps. No grand plantations, no slave wealth, just land that barely gave back what we put into it. When Mississippi voted to leave the Union in 1861, men rode through our county celebrating. They waved Confederate flags and spoke of honor, glory, and sacrifice. They said every able-bodied man would fight. But in our town, people didn't cheer. They went quiet. Because fighting meant leaving fields unplanted. It meant families unprotected. And worst of all, it meant dying for a cause that wasn't ours. The war came to us in the form of tax collectors and conscription officers. Confederate law demanded crops, livestock, and sons. They took corn from families already rationing meals. They took mules from men who needed them to plow. And then they took boys, some barely old enough to shave. I still remember the day they came for my cousin Eli. He stood in the doorway, hands shaking, while an officer read his name from a paper. His mother didn't cry. She just stared at the dirt floor like she was trying to memorize it before it vanished. That was the moment something broke in our town. Men began disappearing, not to join the Confederate Army, but to avoid it. They fled into the Leaf River swamps, a maze of water, cypress trees, and mosquitoes thick enough to choke a man. At first, they hid alone, then in pairs, then as a group. I followed them after my brother never came home from a forced march. What we found in the swamps wasn't safety, it was survival, raw and unforgiving. We slept on raised platforms of pine logs to avoid snakes. We ate what we could trap, hunt, or steal back from Confederate supply wagons that passed too close. And in those dark woods, a dangerous idea began to take shape. What if we didn't fight for either side? What if we refused? We weren't abolitionists. We weren't Union loyalists, not at first. We were farmers who didn't own slaves and had nothing to gain from a rich man's war. The Confederacy called us traitors. The Union didn't even know we existed. So we decided to stand alone. Word spread quietly. Jones County would not send its sons, not anymore. When Confederate soldiers tried to enforce the law, they were ambushed. Supply wagons vanished. Patrols were misled into dead ends of swamp water and quicksand mud. The men who knew the land became ghosts. By 1863, the war had turned brutal everywhere, but in our county, it became personal. Confederate authorities declared us criminals. They burned homes, they arrested women, they executed suspected deserters, and still we refused. Someone nailed a crude sign near Ellisville, the county seat. I never saw it myself, but everyone talked about it. It said, "The Free State of Jones." We weren't declaring independence for glory. We were declaring it for survival. Because once you refuse a war, the war comes for you. And it was already on its way. By the spring of 1863, the Confederacy had stopped pretending we were just scared farmers. They called us outlaws now. The word carried weight. It meant we weren't just deserters, we were enemies, men without protection, men who could be shot without trial. And in a war already soaked in blood, that was a dangerous thing to be. Confederate cavalry began riding deeper into Jones County, no longer asking questions. They burned smokehouses. They dragged women from homes, demanding to know where their husbands were hiding. Some never came back the same after those visits. Some didn't come back at all. I remember the smell of burning pine on the night they torched the Collins place. The fire lit the trees like torches, and we watched from the swamp, powerless. Old Mr. Collins had fought in the Mexican War. He believed in duty once, but when they took his last mule and left his grandchildren hungry, even he said enough. That night taught us something important. Refusing the war wasn't enough anymore. We had to survive it. Life in the swamps became organized. Men who once farmed now planned patrols. Boys learned to shoot quietly. Older men taught us how to read tracks, how to disappear, how to move through water without leaving ripples. Food was our greatest enemy. Confederate raiders had stripped the countryside bare. We trapped rabbits. We fished at night. Sometimes we raided supply convoys, not for glory, but for cornmeal, salt, and shoes. Every stolen sack meant another week alive. And then there was Newton Knight. He wasn't loud, didn't give speeches, didn't dress like a leader, but people listened when he spoke. Knight had deserted the Confederate Army after watching men die for reasons he couldn't believe in anymore. He knew how the military thought, and that made him dangerous. Under his guidance, our resistance hardened. We didn't fight battles, we fought moments. A bridge sabotaged here, a patrol led into quicksand there, a message intercepted before it reached Ellisville. The Confederacy responded with terror. They posted wanted notices with names we recognized. They offered rewards, dead or alive. And when that didn't work, they made examples. I watched from the trees when they hanged young Daniel McLemore. He was barely 20, accused of helping deserters. They didn't wait for proof. They didn't need it. His body stayed there all day as a warning. That was the day fear almost won. Some men talked about surrendering, about slipping away west, about giving in just to save their families. And for a moment, I wondered if survival meant knowing when to kneel. But then word came from unexpected places. Union troops had entered Mississippi. They weren't liberators, but they weren't our hunters either. And slowly, quietly, a truth settled over us. The Confederacy couldn't protect us, and it couldn't defeat us. By late 1863, Jones County had become a problem the Confederate command couldn't solve. Their soldiers were stretched thin, their supply lines were bleeding. Every man sent to hunt us was a man not fighting the Union elsewhere. So they escalated. They sent better trained troops, men who knew counterinsurgency, men who understood how to break resistance, not just kill it. Homes were confiscated, crops seized at gunpoint, entire families forced into camps near Confederate-controlled towns where disease spread faster than food. The war had finally reached our women and children. That changed everything.
Because once a war stops pretending it has rules, people stop pretending they owe it loyalty. We were no longer just hiding, we were preparing. If the Confederacy wanted to crush Jones County, they would have to come into the swamps, and the swamps were ours.
There comes a moment in every fight when neutrality dies. For us, it didn't happen in a grand speech or on a battlefield. It happened quietly, when survival itself demanded a choice. By early 1864, Jones County was no longer hiding. The swamps were crowded with men who had nowhere else to go. Confederate deserters, farmers who refused conscription, even a few enslaved men who had fled plantations after hearing whispers of Union victory. We were no longer just a group of holdouts. We were a community, and communities don't survive without rules. Food was shared, watches were assigned, messengers moved between camps using hidden paths only locals knew. We treated wounds with boiled rags and herbs, and we buried our dead in unmarked ground so the enemy couldn't find them. That was when the question finally came, spoken out loud under the cover of trees and fog. Are we with the Union? The words felt dangerous, even said softly. Some men said yes without hesitation. They'd seen enough of the Confederacy's cruelty. Others hesitated. The Union wasn't innocent. Their armies burned too. They conscripted too. And none of us wanted to trade one master for another. But one truth cut through every argument. The Confederacy had already chosen against us. Newton Knight spoke that night, standing on a fallen cypress trunk. He didn't promise freedom. He didn't promise protection. He said something far simpler and far more honest. If we don't stand together, he said, they'll hang us one by one. That was enough. We didn't raise Union flags. We didn't swear oaths. But when Union scouts moved through the region, we guided them. When Confederate troops advanced, we warned the Union. And when battles passed nearby, we struck Confederate foraging parties and vanished before dawn. It was war now, real war. The first open clash came near Ellisville. A Confederate detachment marched in, confident, expecting scared farmers. Instead, they found prepared men firing from cover, cutting off escape routes, using the land like a weapon. The fight was short, brutal, close. When it ended, several Confederate soldiers lay dead, others fled. For the first time, Jones County had not merely resisted, we had won. News spread faster than we could stop it. Confederate commanders were furious. To them, we weren't just traitors anymore. We were an infection, proof that loyalty could collapse from the inside. Retaliation came swiftly. Families suspected of helping us were rounded up. Some women were imprisoned in makeshift stockades. Children were left without food or shelter. Disease followed hunger, and hunger followed fear. I'll never forget the look in my mother's eyes when I slipped into camp one night and saw how thin she'd become. "You're fighting a war," she whispered, "but we're the ones paying for it." That night nearly broke me, because survival isn't heroic when it costs the people you love. But the next morning, Union troops arrived outside the county, bluecoats moving like a tide the Confederacy could no longer hold back. Their presence didn't end our suffering, but it shifted the balance. For the first time, Confederate patrols hesitated before entering Jones County. For the first time, the hunters were cautious. And for the first time, we allowed ourselves to imagine something dangerous. What if we survive this? The war still raged,
Men still died, but the free state of Jones, mocked, denied, and hunted, had endured longer than anyone expected. We hadn't chosen a flag, we had chosen each other. And once that choice was made, there was no going back.
The Confederacy did not forgive betrayal. Once Jones County proved it could fight back, mercy vanished completely. The officers sent after us were no longer locals who knew our families. They were hardened men, transferred in from elsewhere, ordered to do one thing only: break us. They didn't bother searching the swamps anymore. Instead, they attacked what we loved, what we needed. They took the women. One morning, word reached our camp that Confederate soldiers had gone house to house, dragging wives and mothers from their beds. They claimed it was for questioning. Everyone knew the truth. It was punishment. My sister was among them. I remember the feeling, not rage, not fear, but a hollow cold, like something essential had been torn out of me. A war that steals women and starves children stops being about flags. It becomes about cruelty. The prisoners were kept in crude camps near Ellisville. No shelter from rain, little food. Illness spread fast. Some women gave birth there. Some buried their children there. We watched from the edges of the county, helpless and furious. Some men wanted revenge, immediate, violent revenge. Others warned that any attack would only bring worse retaliation. Every decision felt like choosing who would suffer next. That was when Newton Knight made the hardest call of the war. We would fight, but on our terms. No open battles, no reckless attacks. Every move would have a purpose. Every risk weighed against its cost to our families. The swamps became fortresses. Confederate patrols sent into them came back lost, injured, or not at all. Supply routes feeding Confederate forces in the region began to collapse. Horses disappeared. Wagons burned. Roads became traps. And then came the executions, public ones. They hanged men accused of helping us, sometimes with no proof at all. They left bodies displayed for days. It was meant to terrify us into surrender. Instead, it hardened something inside us. I stood hidden among trees the day they hanged Samuel Bynum. He didn't cry, didn't beg, he just stared forward, jaw set, like a man already gone somewhere they couldn't follow. When they kicked the crate away, something inside Jones County died, and something else was born. We stopped talking about survival. We talked about endurance. Union forces pressed closer now, and Confederate power was bleeding out. Desperation made them crueler, but also weaker. Their control slipped, their patrols thinned, their authority cracked. And in the chaos, something unexpected happened. The women endured. They smuggled food, passed messages, lied to officers' faces without flinching. Some escaped captivity and vanished into the woods with nothing but the clothes they wore. My sister returned one night, skeletal and shaken, but alive. She didn't cry when she saw me. She just said, "Don't stop." That was all. By late 1864, Confederate authority in Jones County existed mostly on paper. They could no longer enforce laws here. They could only punish, randomly, brutally, without control.
And when a government rules only by fear, it is already dying. The war still raged elsewhere, but in our county, something remarkable had happened. We had outlasted them. Not with armies, not with speeches, but with stubborn refusal. They tried to make examples of us. Instead, we became a warning.
Wars don't end all at once. They rot first. By the winter of 1864, the Confederacy in our part of Mississippi was hollow. Orders came late or not at all. Officers argued among themselves. Soldiers deserted openly, sometimes dropping rifles in the road and walking away like men waking from a bad dream. But rot doesn't mean peace, it means uncertainty. Union columns moved closer, their blue coats a sign of change, but also of danger. Some welcomed them. Others remembered stories of burned towns and confiscated land. Freedom promised relief, but it didn't promise mercy. Jones County stood caught between a dying government and an advancing one, and for the first time, we had to think beyond survival. We had lived for months as ghosts, sleeping in mud, moving at night, trusting only those we could see bleed beside us. But what happens when the fighting stops? Do ghosts return home? Newton Kite called a gathering near the Leaf River. Men came carefully, armed but cautious. Some had not seen daylight openly in over a year. Faces were lean, eyes sharp. We looked less like farmers now, and more like something forged by fear. Kite didn't speak long. "The war is ending," he said, "but ending doesn't mean forgiving. We need to decide who we are when the shooting stops." That question frightened me more than any Confederate patrol ever had, because war gives purpose, peace demands responsibility. Union troops finally entered Ellisville in early 1865. The Confederate flag came down without a fight. There was no dramatic surrender, just exhausted men leaving town, some in uniform, some not. People stepped out of hiding slowly, like animals testing air after a fire. Homes were in ruins, fields untended, livestock gone, graves unmarked. We had survived, but survival had a price. Union officers questioned us. Some saw us as allies, others saw us as troublemakers who didn't respect authority. They took notes, made lists, promised protection they couldn't guarantee. Slavery was ending. For many, that was the first true sign the war meant something beyond suffering. Freed men and women moved cautiously, unsure where they belonged now. The chains were gone, but hatred remained. And Jones County, our county, stood in a strange place. We had resisted the Confederacy, we had aided the Union, but we belonged fully to neither. Old grudges didn't vanish with the war. Confederate sympathizers returned quietly. Some pretending loyalty never wavered. They remembered who defied them, who embarrassed them, who survived when they didn't. Violence didn't end with the war. It changed shape. Night riders appeared. Threats whispered. Former Confederates reclaimed power through fear when uniforms no longer protected them. Once again, survival was not guaranteed. I realized then that the hardest part of the war wasn't fighting it, it was living after it. We tried to rebuild. Fields were cleared, cabins repaired, children learned to sleep without gunfire. But trust was harder. Every knock at night felt dangerous. Every stranger carried memory. And still, something remarkable held. Jones County did not surrender its spirit. We had learned to rely on each other,
not governments, not generals. When violence threatened, we stood together. When outsiders tried to claim control, we resisted quietly but firmly. The free state of Jones was never written into law, but it lived, not as a nation, but as a refusal to be broken. The war had taken years from our lives. It did not take our will. When the guns finally fell silent, many people believed the danger had passed. They were wrong. The Civil War ended on paper in 1865, but in Jones County, the fighting simply changed its clothes. No uniforms, no bugles, no clear enemy lines, just neighbors watching neighbors and remembering. Reconstruction arrived like a stranger who promised help but didn't stay long enough to protect anyone. Union officials came first. They spoke of rebuilding, of new laws, of rights that had never existed before. For a moment, hope felt possible. Freed man registered marriages, searched for lost family, and tried to build lives from ashes. Schools were promised, protection was promised, but promises are fragile things. Federal troops were too few. Their attention was stretched thin across the South, and when they left, when their blue coats vanished down dusty roads, the old power crept back in, quietly. Men who had once worn gray formed night groups. They didn't call themselves soldiers anymore. They called themselves guardians, protectors, restorers of order. But everyone knew what they really were. They came after people like us, not in daylight, not openly, but with ropes, torches, and whispers. They burned barns, left threats nailed to doors, dragged men from beds, and beat them in fields where no one would hear. They wanted us to remember who had ruled before, and they wanted us afraid enough to obey. Once again, Jones County had to decide how to survive. We couldn't fight them like before. No swamps to disappear into. No enemy supply lines to sabotage. This war lived in shadows and fear. So we adapted. We watched roads, traveled in pairs, left signs only locals understood. When someone vanished, we searched immediately because delay meant death. Freed families were the most vulnerable. They had everything to lose and nowhere to hide. Many of us stood guard for them at night, armed but silent, listening for hoofbeats or breaking branches. I remember one night clearly. A fire burned on the far edge of a field, too controlled to be an accident. We gathered without speaking, shadows among shadows. The riders never came closer. They knew we were ready. That was our victory. Not loud, not celebrated, but enough. Newton Knight warned us not to become what we hated. No lynchings, no revenge raids. He believed survival now meant restraint, that law, even imperfect law, was better than endless blood. It wasn't an easy lesson, because every scar begged for payback. Slowly, painfully, life began to stabilize. Crops grew again. Children learned letters. Some of the men who terrorized us faded into silence as federal pressure returned in waves. But peace never fully settled. Too much had been seen. Too much had been lost. I understood then that survival doesn't mean safety. It means persistence. The free state of Jones had survived the Confederacy. Now it survived memory, resentment, and unfinished justice. And we did it the same way we always had, together, quietly, stubbornly.
Time doesn't erase wars. It edits them. Years passed. Fields recovered. Children grew into adults who had never heard cannon fire, only stories told in low voices. Jones County began to look like any other southern place trying to heal. Church bells on Sundays, crops in rows, laughter returning carefully. But memory is a battlefield too. After Reconstruction faded, the story of the Civil War hardened into something simpler, something cleaner. Heroes and villains were drawn in sharp lines, flags were folded neatly into myths, and people like us didn't fit. We were inconvenient. We hadn't fought for the Confederacy, which made us traitors in some eyes, but we hadn't worn Union blue either, which meant no monuments, no parades, no protection in history books. So we were left out. When I traveled beyond the county, I learned quickly to keep quiet. Mention Jones County and faces changed. Some laughed, some frowned, some accused. The free state of Jones became a rumor, something exaggerated, something misunderstood, something best ignored. That hurt more than the hunger ever did, because survival without recognition feels like erasure. Newton Knight lived long enough to see this happen. He never chased glory, never tried to correct every lie, but I could see the weight in his eyes when people dismissed what we'd endured. They said we were deserters. They didn't say we protected families. They didn't say we stood against starvation. They didn't say we survived when surrender meant death. History prefers simplicity. Real survival is complicated. Even inside the county, silence grew. Some wanted to forget the fear. Others wanted to forget which side they'd been on. Talking about the war reopened wounds that never truly healed. But forgetting has consequences. Old resentments fester, lies grow comfortable, and future generations inherit stories shaped by shame instead of truth. I told my children anyway, not as legends, not as rebellion, but as warning. I told them that governments can fail people, that loyalty must be earned, that survival sometimes means refusing to be used by forces that don't care if you live. I told them that courage doesn't always march under a flag. Sometimes it hides in swamps. Sometimes it feeds a neighbor while starving itself. Sometimes it survives quietly and pays the price for doing so. By the time I grew old, the free state of Jones had become a footnote, if that, a curiosity mentioned briefly, often incorrectly. Outsiders argued about whether it ever really existed. We knew better, because we had lived it. Survival isn't proven by documents, it's proven by scars. And Jones County was covered in them.
Decades passed. The children I raised grew into adults with their own struggles, their own wars to fight. Jones County seemed like any other place now, quiet, sleepy, with the faint echo of guns long gone. But the story of our survival never stayed buried. It returned in whispers first. Travelers passing through would mention the free state of Jones with a laugh, a shake of the head, or sometimes admiration. Occasionally, newspapers would print a story about Newton Knight and the men who refused the Confederacy, but the details were messy, distorted, embroidered, or ignored entirely. History had a way of forgetting people like us, but truth, no matter how quiet, has a stubbornness all its own. I saw it most clearly in my grandchildren. They didn't understand the war the way I did, not the blood, the fear, or the nights spent huddled in cypress swamps listening to soldiers' boots crush leaves, but they sensed something in their bones had survived, something their parents had carried silently through the years. One afternoon, my grandson asked me, "Grandpa, did you really hide in the swamps?" I looked at him and nodded. "We did more than hide," I said. "We survived, and we made sure our families did too." He didn't fully grasp it, but I saw understanding in his eyes, a spark. The story was moving forward through generations, carried by those who had not lived it, but had inherited the weight of it. And then the scholars came. Books were written. Movies were imagined. Some romanticized, some vilified, some missed the point entirely. They debated Newton Knight's motives, the legality of our defiance, the ethics of survival under fire. They turned our lived reality into chapters and footnotes, as if the scars and blood could be captured in ink. I didn't care about the fame or the judgment. What mattered was that the story persisted, that someone remembered that survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's messy, and sometimes it's all that stands between life and obliteration. The war had taken so much, but it could not take our will. It could not erase the free state of Jones from the people who lived it. Even as time eroded the county's old landmarks, even as neighbors passed away and farms changed hands, the spirit endured. Because survival, when forged in desperation, becomes legend by default, not because anyone chooses to call it a legend, but because the truth refuses to die. I still walk the county roads in the evenings, when the sun is low and shadows stretch across the fields. I can see echoes of those nights hiding in the swamps, of fires burning and guns firing. The earth remembers, the river remembers, and I remember. I tell my grandchildren and anyone who will listen that courage doesn't always come with banners and armies. Sometimes it comes with a steady hand, a silent prayer, and the stubborn refusal to be broken. That is what allowed us to survive the war, the cruelty, and the years that followed. And so the story continues, not in grand monuments, not in history books, but in the memory of those who refuse to forget. The free state of Jones may never appear on maps, but it exists wherever people choose survival over submission. It exists in the quiet moments of defiance, in protecting family against impossible odds, and in the steadfastness of those who carry truth through generations. And as long as someone remembers, it can never truly die.
By the time I was old, I realized that survival doesn't end when danger fades. It carries forward like water trickling through roots, shaping everything it touches long after the flood is past. Jones County survived the war. It survived Reconstruction. It survived the erasure attempted by history. But perhaps most remarkably, it survived as a symbol. Not a symbol shouted from banners or etched into monuments, but a symbol living quietly in the choices people make when they refuse to be broken. Our defiance inspired caution in the powerful. Officers who had once sought to crush us learned that stubbornness could withstand their authority. Families who had lived in fear learned that protection sometimes comes from within, not from laws or armies. And generations after the war learned that courage often looks ordinary on the outside until it is tested by extraordinary circumstances. I watched my grandchildren grow, and I saw traces of us in them. The careful observation, the quick thinking, the quiet loyalty to family and community. I saw it in how they treated neighbors, how they helped strangers, and how they never forgot the weight of justice. Newton Knight's name became legend over the years. Some called him a hero, some a rebel, some a man who simply survived. But what mattered most wasn't the labels. It was that his actions reminded people that survival sometimes means breaking rules, not for greed, not for glory, but for life itself. And yet, as legend grew, so did distortion. Books simplified stories, movies dramatized events. People argued about who deserved credit and who did not. Some minimized the suffering, some romanticized it. But truth, our truth, remained stubbornly in the memories of those who had lived it. I walked the county roads often, watching the world change around me. Railroads came, new towns sprouted, technology shrank distances, but the swamps remembered, the rivers remembered, and in the quiet moments of reflection, I remembered everything. The fear, the hunger, the fire, the blood, the whispered decisions made in the dark. There's a peculiar power in knowing history firsthand while the world forgets it. You become a guardian of memory, and in that role, responsibility doesn't end with survival. It extends into the future. I made sure the stories were told, not for fame, not for approval, but for understanding, for recognition of what it truly meant to survive a war that didn't care whether you lived or died, for proof that sometimes resistance itself is the highest form of courage. People still argue about the Free State of Jones today. Some insist it was exaggeration, some insist it was impossible, but the truth is simple. A community refused to be broken. That refusal changed lives then, and it continues to ripple forward. The final lesson is clear. Survival is not just about living. It is about standing firm in your convictions, protecting those you love, and ensuring that your choices, no matter how quiet or unnoticed, leave a mark that endures. And Jones County endures. Not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in the memory of those who lived there and in the stories that refuse to die.
I have lived long enough to see the world change more times than I can count. Railroads, telegraphs, automobiles, towns rebuilt, forests felled, and rivers redirected. Yet in all that change, one thing remained constant: the story of the people who refused to be broken. Jones County survived the Civil War when many thought it impossible. It survived Reconstruction when threats lurked in the night. It survived the erasure of history when historians and politicians simplified the past to fit tidy narratives. And most importantly, it survived in the hearts and memories of those who lived it. Survival is not a moment, it is a process, a long, painful negotiation between fear and courage, hunger and hope, loss and love. Every choice we made, every night we spent shivering in the swamps or sneaking through shadows, every time we protected a neighbor or a child was survival.
Not heroic, not grand, but essential. I often wonder what it means to survive a war that doesn't care about your life, a government that doesn't care about your family, and neighbors who cannot be trusted. It means learning patience. It means choosing battles carefully. It means knowing that sometimes the quiet acts, the shared meal, the hidden warning, the whispered prayer, carry more weight than any rifle. And yet, survival alone is not enough. We learned that when the war ended, because peace does not erase the past. It doesn't erase fear. It doesn't erase loss. It only provides the opportunity to endure, rebuild, and teach. I taught my children, and they taught theirs. We passed down not only the story of Newton Knight and the men who refused the Confederacy, but the lesson that courage is not always loud, that defiance can take the form of a hand held, a secret path followed, a neighbor protected, that survival is entwined with responsibility. History may have tried to forget us. Scholars may have simplified our choices. Movies may have dramatized our struggles, but the truth is stubborn, as we were. The free state of Jones exists wherever people choose integrity over obedience, community over isolation, life over fear. Walking the county roads in the evenings, I see the legacy in the small things, the fields that grow corn, the rivers that carry water, the families who care for one another. I see it in the quiet determination etched on the faces of men and women who have no idea that their courage echoes a century and a half ago. I think back to the men I lost, to the fires that burned, to the children we protected. I remember every fear and every triumph, and I understand now that survival is not only about living, it is about creating the conditions for life to continue, even when the world itself seems determined to destroy it. If someone asks me what the free state of Jones truly was, I would tell them it was not a flag, it was not a law, it was a choice to endure, a choice to protect, a choice to remain human when inhumanity surrounded us. And that choice, quiet, steadfast, and unyielding, has lasted far longer than any army, any law, or any battlefield. In the end, survival was never just about us. It was about the generations who would come after us. It was about showing that courage can take root in the humblest of places and endure when everything else falls away. That is the legacy of Jones County. That is the story that refuses to die.